Welcome back to the book log, everybody. Today I'm talking about The Secret History by Donna Tartt. And I'm just going to mention off the top, spoilers. There will be spoilers in this review. It's interesting to me that The Secret History is considered the definitive dark academia novel, or at least a lot of people say that it is. It's a pretty niche genre that this book is purported to have invented, more or less, or is at the very least like the main benchmark for a comparison as far as I can tell. I've never really read a book like that before that embodies a whole genre in this way. What's interesting though is that the book itself doesn't feel particularly genre breaking to me. It really reads more like a regular literary thriller, I guess I would say, but it's also so incredibly propulsive and entertaining that I guess it just took on a life of its own. It became a cult classic, and because it's so distinctive in its tone and texture and mood and atmosphere, and because it's executed so precisely, now an entire literary aesthetic orbits around it. Despite all of that expectation, the book has a relatively unassuming premise. It's narrated in the first person by Richard Papin, who leaves behind his unremarkable middle-class life in suburban California to attend Hampton College, which is this incredibly rich, posh, pretentious, insular private school tucked away in the hills of rural Vermont. He majors in classics and manages to squeeze his way into an even smaller, more exclusive class within the school, taught by the enigmatic Professor Julian Morrow. The other 5 students in the class are Henry, twins Camilla and Charles, Francis, and Edmund Corcoran, better known as Bunny. Initially, these characters are painted with an almost mythical air of elegance and mystery. They just seem untouchably refined and smart and witty and charming and beautiful and graceful and wealthy. They quote ancient Greek offhand. They spend their weekends in country houses. They just kind of carry themselves with an effortless superiority that Richard finds intoxicating. Richard is somewhat of a guarded and inscrutable narrator, so it's hard to gauge precisely, but there's just some mixture of admiration or envy that draws him to this group in an almost magnetic way. This is such a deeply character-driven novel, and the whole group is rendered so vividly and convincingly that it feels worth taking a moment to describe each of them individually to set the scene, or at least relay how they're described and perceived by Richard. At the center of it all is Professor Julian Morrow, ostensibly the reason this entire group exists. He's this elegant, also almost mythical figure. He's a man of immense culture and taste with mysterious connections to high society. There's several casual references to famous acquaintances he has that are dropped throughout the novel. He's incredibly personable and kind, but perhaps a bit performative, more charm than substance. He now presides over this secluded little department teaching Greek language and philosophy and aesthetics. He has a very close relationship with the class, and they will occasionally do a fancy dinner or something to that effect, but he's still professional and their teacher and isn't necessarily involved with their lives or activities outside of the classroom. Then there's Henry Winter, who is kind of the de facto leader of the group. He's described as extremely intelligent, bordering on brilliant, very well-read and impeccably polite and proper, but he also has a coldness to him. He's kind of intimidating and severe, very stoic, very analytical, lives inside his own head, but at the same time, he's this impressive larger-than-life figure that the whole group defers to in a lot of ways. Charles and Camilla, the twins, are the most outwardly normal of the group, I would say. They are warm and kind and genuinely likable, although there are also some not quite so normal tinges to their relationship as well. They aren't quite as wealthy as the others, but they are just effortlessly charming and beautiful and captivating. Then there's Francis with his bright red hair and little round glasses and dark fashion sense, wry sense of humor. He's the eccentric of the group, very dramatic, very cynical. He's openly gay, also very self-aware in a way that a lot of the rest of the group is not. And lastly, there is Bunny Corcoran, who is essentially all surface level charm. He's described as funny, affable, full of this kind of debaucherous old boys club bravado, sort of like a rich, genial frat boy type. But beneath this veneer, he's very crude and self-serving and annoying and just sort of oblivious to how grating he can be. He's also not really rich, like his parents don't give him any money, so he's actually poor and just takes constant advantage of his friends to give him extravagant amounts of money that he doesn't pay back. He's both the comic relief of the group, but also the catalyst for all of the dark tragedy that follows, as it is revealed right away in the prologue that Bunny gets murdered for some reason by the rest of the group. I think the decision to have Bunny's murder revealed right away at the start of the book was a fantastic choice, honestly. It gives the story a kind of unique tension where the reader is still afforded all the mystery and momentum of a classic whodunit, but since you already know the end result, the focus is shifted from what happened to why it happened. As the book starts to draw you towards this event that you already know about, it builds this deep feeling of dread, like you have to watch this slow, inexorable march towards something that you know is inevitable. The question is not who killed Bunny, but how did we get from there to here? And the whole puzzle of it is just so endlessly fascinating and dark and addictive. Bunny's death is very literally the central event of the story. Even though it's revealed in the prologue, the event itself happens narratively pretty much right in the exact middle of the book, which gives the whole thing two very distinct halves: what led up to the murder and then the aftermath of the murder. The first half is definitely where this book is at its most propulsive, genuinely a page-turner. We're introduced to this vivid, magnetic group of characters. We watch their relationships deepen, but we also see Richard slowly get drawn further and further into their orbit until you can kind of see the cracks in the facade start to show. The inciting incident revolves around a bacchanalia, which is something the group presumably learned about in their Greek studies. It's this real ancient ritual based on Dionysian festivals in ancient Greece where participants sought to lose themselves completely, to transcend reason and dissolve into a kind of wild, animalistic, chaotic ecstasy. For whatever reason, the whole concept is fascinating to the group, especially Henry, almost as like an intellectual experiment more than anything. And we learn later that the group, besides Richard, attempted to get really drunk and recreate one several times. Now, before I go on and explain why that's important, I have to mention one of my favorite sections of the whole book. There's this strikingly memorable part during winter break when Richard has to spend multiple weeks alone in a frozen, decrepit apartment owned by this really bitter mandolin repairman. His room has no insulation, there's a hole in the ceiling that constantly lets snow drift inside, and he just spends days on end shivering and suffering and on the edge of like legitimate medical grade hypothermia. It's one of the most vividly written parts of the novel. It's so lucid and haunting and weirdly beautiful, and the reason I bring it up is because he is rescued from the situation by none other than Henry, who brings him to the hospital, lets him stay at his place for the rest of the winter, and during this time reveals to Richard what happened during their bacchanalia. According to Henry, everyone in the group besides Richard and Bunny got completely wasted and went out into the woods to lose themselves in this ritual frenzy. Apparently none of them remember exactly what happened. Their reports of the evening are fragmented and contradictory, besides the fact that at some point in the midst of their trance, they ended up brutally murdering a local farmer. Like, tore his limbs from his body kind of brutal murder. Again, they claim that they were completely out of it and that they were hallucinating and disoriented. They remember being chased or possibly chasing something, maybe a deer, but the details are foggy and they have no concrete recollections beyond that. And because Henry is so clever and manipulative, he is somehow able to draw Richard into the cover-up for this murder that he wasn't involved in at all. It's also Richard's own fault, obviously, being so obsessed with ingratiating himself into this group that he's willing to help cover up this murder to the point of complicity. And this is where things get complicated for Bunny, because despite being painted as shallow, he's actually the only one who is clearly extremely distraught by this. He also wasn't involved, of course, and because he is the way he is, he becomes a huge liability to the group by constantly referring to the murder of the farmer. He can't stop making jokes about it and hinting at it to outsiders, pointing people's attention to the strange murder that's being reported in the papers and whatnot. And it's this very behavior that slowly leads the group to the idea that their only way out of this and the only way to protect themselves is to get rid of Bunny. It's interesting interesting because there isn't really a formal discussion about this or one instance where the decision is made. Instead, they kind of all slowly come to the same unspoken collective conclusion that this is what needs to be done, and they begin to coordinate it and plan it together. They have a bunch of strange and absurd ideas at first, like poisoning him or something, but eventually they decide to just keep it simple and push him off the ravine in the woods behind the school. The murder scene itself is incredibly tense and somber, and a lot of it is kept tactfully off page, despite the scene being detailed in both the prologue and at the end of part 1. Bunny encounters everyone in the woods while on his walk, kind of incredulously asks, "What are you guys doing here?" And the rest is more or less implied. They, specifically Henry, push him off the edge of the ravine where he falls to his death. The group leaves the woods, gets into Henry's car, and just drives home in silence. And from this point on, the tone and plot of the book shift pretty dramatically for the entirety of part 2. The first half is very fast-paced and dramatic and mysterious and thrilling. Even though you already know the outcome, the stakes are just so high. Ironically, the second half does the opposite. You have no idea what's going to happen or where the story is heading, but instead of this driving energy, the book takes on a tone that's much more tense and anxious and somber. I still found it to be very compelling, but in a much different way than the first part. It becomes less about why this murder happened and more about the reality of their actions and the psychological toll it takes on them. More than once, Donna Tartt invokes crime and punishment in this book, which I found to be an incredibly apt comparison. Like, how does someone process and reckon with a murder that they committed? How does that guilt and dread manifest? I think Raskolnikov and Richard Papin deal with it in much different ways, but that's a conversation for another time, I think. In the book, it plays out as follows. First, the group originally intended for Bunny's body to just be found shortly after the murder and have it be deemed an accident. Instead, coincidentally, it snows the night of the murder, which covers and conceals Bunny's body for about 2 weeks. Because of this, his disappearance becomes much more of an ordeal than anyone expected. The police and the FBI get involved. They interrogate students across the campus, including Henry and Charles, and the two of them do an okay job of remaining composed, but it ends up being a lot more stressful than they intended. There are whole search parties organized, and the rest of the group has to struggle to act like how they would act in this situation if they truly didn't know what was going on, even though they do. They essentially have to pretend to be heartbroken and confused and to act out grief that, by all accounts, they don't actually feel. Eventually, the snow melts, they recover the body, and as his supposed closest friends, the group is obligated to drive to Bunny's hometown in Connecticut to attend his funeral and spend time with his family, which makes for some suffocatingly tense scenes, especially with Henry, who is Bunny's best friend and knew him for years and is close with his family. It's during this time that the reality of the situation really starts to set in. They orchestrated this murder out of convenience for themselves, but they are now faced with the very human reality of the grief and loss and suffering that they caused. They have to sit in Bunny's living room and accept condolences from the people whose lives they just destroyed. Them talking to Bunny's brothers and his parents just feels so dark and grim, and Donna Tartt just does a wonderful job of capturing this overwhelming, rending dread. Their actions seem so absurd and stupid and insane in retrospect, but they are forced to brace through this extreme tension. And now, in addition to that, there's also this acute sense of paranoia, both with regards to the police investigating a potential murder, but also amongst each other. Everyone is suspicious of one another. The whole group dynamic is completely fractured. Charles is falling apart mentally and fighting constantly with Henry. He's also drifting away from Camilla. Francis and Richard are caught between them. Everyone is afraid of what everyone else might do. The mood is just totally poisonous, and importantly, if it weren't clear before, it's made abundantly obvious that none of these kids are as smart or sophisticated as they think they are. They are painted as such by Richard, the narrator, but all of them, himself included, are essentially just clueless, stupid maniacs who killed their friend for no reason. I did also appreciate the very ending sequence of this book. One day, Julian informs the group that he found a letter from Bunny written before his death sitting in his mailbox. The letter reveals everything about the first murder of the farmer and how scared Bunny was for retaliation and for his safety, especially in relation to Henry. At first, Julian assumes it must be some kind of hoax, and everyone is scrambling to reinforce this this notion, but the truth eventually becomes undeniable when it turns out that one of the pages of the letter was written on this very specific stationery that clearly spells out the name of the exact hotel Bunny and Henry were known to have stayed in while they were on vacation together in Italy. Instead of turning them in, though, Julian just gives the letter to Henry and flees Vermont, essentially, and is never seen by any of them ever again. Kind of a condemnation of Julian's weak character. Despite how much admiration and reverence is heaped upon him by Richard in the narration, he turns out to be sort of a coward in the face of the rot that he helped to nurture and create. And the book also has this perfectly Greek tragedy ending. Charles's drinking kind of starts to spiral out of control, and his resentment towards Henry grows more and more violent every day, especially as Henry begins living with Camilla. At some point, Charles is arrested for drunk driving in Henry's car, so Henry fears Charles will expose the group, while Charles fears that Henry might kill him to keep his silence. And this all culminates with Charles barging into Camilla and Henry's hotel room with a gun and trying to kill Henry. In the ensuing altercation, Charles accidentally shoots Richard in the stomach, and then when the staff come to check out all the commotion, Henry grabs the gun and shoots himself. This ending is obviously extremely bleak, but I think it is nonetheless fitting. These people are nihilistic and arrogant, and as a result, they bring about their own self-destruction. It really does feel like an old tragedy. It feels inevitable. It feels destined. But in spite of that, it's a very compelling and captivating story, the way all great tragedies are. I also want to take this time to share a really fantastic theory I heard about this book. Throughout the story, there are several offhanded references to mountain lions living in the area. At one point, Charles and Richard even think they see one cross the road in the middle of the night. What if during the Bacchanalia, they didn't kill the farmer at all? What if it was a mountain lion? They say that they sort of remember being chased by some animal, and the farmer's injuries were unusually gruesome. It's not confirmed, but that would add an additional layer of tragedy that even by their own justifications, Bunny's death was completely unnecessary. Just interesting to think about. It's hard to articulate why I love this book so much. There's some ineffable thing that's hard to describe. I think talking about the plot like this makes it sound like more of a depressing slog than it actually is, but that's really not the case. There's a lot of levity in this book. There's a lot of humor. Donna Tartt is just such a clever writer in so many places that even when the subject matter is dark, it's just pleasant and enjoyable to take in the timbre of her prose. And she's able to take all of her strengths as a writer and simultaneously infuse the story with this crystal clear narrative propulsion that just makes the whole thing so fascinating and so addicting. Really, truly excellent stuff. I'm going to give this book a 10 out of 10.